June 14th, 1789, Saint-Domingue, the western province of Hispaniola. In the suffocating heat of a French colonial plantation nestled between the mountains of Plaisance and the Atlantic's dark waters, a woman stood 7 inches past 6 feet tall, her shadow stretching across the cane fields like a prophecy carved in darkness. They called her Abeni, a name that meant we prayed for her in the Yoruba tongue, but the overseers called her the Beast, and the master's children crossed themselves when she passed. On this night, under a moon swollen red as infected flesh, the earth would remember her true name, and the stones would drink the blood of the man who believed giants could be owned. Abeni was not born into chains, she was bred into them. Her mother, a woman of the Fulani warrior lineage, had been taken during a raid in West Africa and sold to a French plantation owner obsessed with cultivating human beings as one might cultivate tobacco or indigo. He sought size, strength, endurance. Abeni's father was a captured Mandinka chieftain, a man of mountainous build and silent rage. She inherited both their heights and their hatreds. By the age of 16, she towered above every soul on the plantation, her hands capable of snapping sugarcane stalks as if they were kindling, her back scarred into a topographical map of cruelty. But tonight was different. Tonight, Henri Delacroix, the master's eldest son, a man who wore violence like cologne and entitlement like a second skin, had made his final mistake. What transforms a human being into a myth? What singular moment turns flesh into legend, bone into ballad? The answer lies not in the act itself, but in the why, the accumulation of indignities, the thousand cuts that precede the one fatal wound, the quiet girl who becomes the storm. This is not a story of savagery. This is a story of reckoning. And if you have ever wondered what happens when the giant wakes, when the silent finally scream, when the earth itself demands payment in blood, then stay with me now. Subscribe to this channel because what you are about to witness is not entertainment. It is testimony. It is the moment a slave woman became a god of vengeance and a master learned that bones break easier than spirits. Let us descend into that night. Let us bear witness. The plantation was called La Couronne Noire, the Black Crown, a name dripping with the bitter irony only colonizers could conceive. It sprawled across 2,000 acres of blood-soaked earth, where sugarcane grew tall on the minerals leached from African bones buried shallow in the fields. The main house stood like a white monument to theft, its columns imported from Paris, its marble floors cooled by the sweat of those who would never walk upon them as anything but servants. Henri Delacroix, 28 years old, had inherited his father's estate 6 months prior, and with it he inherited the old man's appetites. But where his father had been cruel with calculation, Henri was cruel with pleasure. He did not see Abeni as property to be managed. He saw her as a curiosity to be broken, a challenge to his manhood, a giant woman whose very existence felt like an insult to the natural order he believed God had designed with him at the center. He had been watching her for weeks. During the harvest, when she bent to cut cane, her muscles rippling beneath skin the color of polished mahogany. During the evening counts, when she stood silent in the line of slaves, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon, beyond the ocean, beyond this life entirely. He mistook her silence for stupidity. He mistook her stillness for submission. He did not understand that Abeni had learned long ago that the only way to survive was to become stone, unreadable, unreachable, untouchable in every way that mattered. But Henri Delacroix was a man who believed every lock had a key, every fortress a weak point, every woman a breaking threshold. On the morning of June 14th, he summoned her to the main house. The other slaves exchanged glances but said nothing. They had learned that to speak was to share in punishment, that solidarity was a luxury they could not afford. Abeni walked toward the white columns with the steady gait of someone walking toward execution, her bare feet soundless on the gravel path, her heart a war drum in her chest. She did not know this was the day, but her bones knew, her blood knew. the moon, even in daylight, knew. Inside the main house, the air was different, cooler, perfumed with imported lavender and the faint metallic tang of silver being polished in distant rooms. Abeni had been inside only twice before, once as a child when the old master wanted to display his collection of unusual slaves to visiting merchants, and once to carry a fainting white woman upstairs during a summer ball. Both times she had kept her eyes lowered, her presence as minimal as a 7-foot frame could manage. But today Henry stood in the center of the receiving room, a crystal glass of rum in his hand, his jacket discarded over a velvet chair. He looked at her the way a hunter looks at a trapped animal, with anticipation, with entitlement, with the casual certainty of someone who has never faced consequence. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked in French, though he knew she understood Creole better. He enjoyed forcing her to translate in her mind, enjoyed the small confusion that flickered across faces when he used the language of power. Abeni said nothing. Her silence filled the room like smoke. Henry smiled, mistaking it for fear. "You're here because I'm curious," he continued, circling her slowly, his boots clicking against marble. "Curious if a woman your size feels things the way normal women do. Curious if all that strength extends to other capacities." He let the implication hang in the air like a noose. Abeni's jaw tightened, the only visible reaction. Her hands, massive and calloused, hung at her sides. She had survived 17 years of this world by swallowing her rage, by compressing every impulse toward violence into a stone she carried in her chest. But the stone was growing heavier, hotter. It was becoming magma. Henry stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the rum on his breath, the pomade in his hair, the underlying rot of a man who had never been denied anything. He reached out and placed his hand on her arm, his fingers barely wrapping halfway around the circumference of her bicep. "Remarkable," he whispered, squeezing. "Like touching marble. Tell me, do you break like marble too?" That was his first mistake. Touch. There is a moment before violence when the world holds its breath, when even the dust motes suspended in sunlight seem to pause, when the clock on the mantel stops ticking, when God himself leans forward to watch what comes next. This was that moment. Abeni stood motionless as Henri's hand traveled from her arm to her shoulder, his fingers tracing the landscape of scars that crisscrossed her skin like the map of every injustice she had endured. He was emboldened by her stillness, mistaking her frozen rage for compliance. He did not see the way her pupils had dilated to black moons, the way her breathing had shifted from shallow survival to the deep rhythmic preparation of something primal awakening. "You'll do as I say," Henri murmured, his voice thick with assumption. "And if you resist, I'll have you whipped until there's no skin left on that enormous back of yours. But if you cooperate—" He let the sentence dissolve into implication, his other hand moving to the belt at his waist. In his mind, this was already decided. In his world, her body was already his, had always been his, would always be his. He was simply claiming what he believed God and law and nature had granted him. He did not understand that there are boundaries even slavery cannot cross, lines even tyranny cannot erase, thresholds where the human spirit says no more in a language older than words. Abeni's eyes shifted. For the first time since entering the house, she looked directly at him, not at his chest or his feet or the middle distance beyond his shoulder, but into his eyes. And what Henri saw there made something in his lizard brain scream in warning. He saw no fear, no resignation. He saw the accumulated weight of every lash, every slur, every indignity compressed into a single point of absolute clarity. He saw a woman who had just decided she would rather die than submit. He saw a giant remembering she was a giant. His hand hesitated on his belt. He took a half-step backward. It was too late. The choice had been made. The world exhaled. What happened next took 3 seconds and rewrote the architecture of Henri Delacroix's understanding of the universe. Abeni's right hand, a hand that had cut 10 tons of sugarcane per day, a hand that had carried water buckets weighing 70 pounds in each palm, a hand that was more weapon than appendage, shot forward and closed around his throat, not gently, not tentatively, with the decisive finality of a bear trap snapping shut. Henry's eyes bulged, his mouth opened in a soundless scream. His hands flew to her wrist, trying to pry away fingers that felt like iron bands wrapped in flesh. He might as well have tried to move a mountain. Abeni lifted him, until his boots scraped uselessly against the marble floor, until he was staring down at her from a height he'd never experienced, until he understood with crystalline terror that he was no longer the predator in this room. "You wanted to know if I break like marble," Abeni said quietly in Creole, her voice steady as a judge pronouncing sentence. "Let us see if you break like porcelain." Her accent was thick, her French barely functional, but her meaning was a knife with perfect clarity. Henri tried to speak, tried to beg, tried to command, but no air moved through his crushed windpipe. His face shifted from red to purple. Veins stood out on his forehead like tributaries on a map of desperation. He clawed at her arm, his fingernails leaving shallow scratches that Abeni felt the way mountains feel rain, distant, irrelevant beneath notice. She walked forward, carrying him as if he weighed nothing, his legs kicking in increasingly weak spasms. She moved toward the marble fireplace, toward the mantel where a bronze clock ticked away the final seconds of Henri Delacroix's life. And then, with the same casual efficiency she used to crack sugarcane stalks, Abeni slammed his head against the marble edge. Once. The sound was like a melon splitting. Twice. Bone gave way with a wet crunch. 3 times, just to be certain, just to make a point, just to ensure that every slave who heard this story would know, giants do not break, masters do. So the body fell in sections, first the legs crumpling, then the torso folding, finally the head lolling at an angle God never intended for the living. Blood pooled on the white marble floor, spreading in a slow crimson tide that reflected the late afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. Abeni stood over him, chest heaving, her hands still tingling from the impact, from the sensation of bone collapsing beneath her palm like eggshell. She waited for remorse to arrive. She had been taught by missionaries that to take a life was to damn one's soul, that murder was the unforgivable sin, that even slaves must turn the other cheek unto 70 times 7. But no remorse came, no guilt visited her in that breathless moment. What came instead was clarity. What came was a savage, liberating truth. I am not sorry. She looked at her hands, these hands that had been instruments of labor, tools of profit, extensions of another man's will, and saw them now for what they truly were, weapons of divine retribution. The missionaries had lied, or perhaps they had simply never understood that God plays favorites, that the meek inherit nothing but graves, that heaven keeps a separate ledger for those who die in chains versus those who break them. Abeni had spent 17 years swallowing her humanity to survive, and in 3 seconds she had vomited it back into the world in the form of righteous violence. She felt more human now, standing over a corpse, than she had felt in a decade of obedience. The clock on the mantel, now spattered with Henri's blood, continued its indifferent ticking. 4 o'clock. The overseers would come for evening count in 2 hours. The house slaves would begin preparing dinner soon. Someone would discover this. Someone always discovered everything on a plantation. Surveillance was the invisible crop they harvested more reliably than sugar. Abeni had perhaps minutes, perhaps an hour if fortune smiled. She could run. The mountains were close. Maroon communities of escaped slaves hid in those peaks, building invisible kingdoms in the clouds. But running felt insufficient. Running felt like the story ended with her as victim turned fugitive rather than what she was becoming, an avenging angel with blood on her hands and revolution in her bones. She made her decision in the space between heartbeats. If she was going to die, and she had no illusions about survival now, then her death would carry meaning, it would echo. It would be the kind of story slaves whispered to their children in the dark, the kind that planted seeds of possibility in soil that had known only despair. Abeni turned from Henry's body and walked deeper into the house, her bare feet leaving bloody footprints on the pristine floors like a trail of prophecy. She moved through rooms she had only glimpsed from doorways, the dining hall with its chandelier of 1,000 crystals, the library with leather-bound books in languages she couldn't read, the study where the old master had kept his ledgers recording human beings as units and stock and losses. She found what she was looking for in the smoking room, the weapons, a collection of rifles mounted on the wall like trophies, remnants from Henri's grandfather's time as a military officer in the French colonial marines. Abeni had never fired a gun. Slaves caught touching firearms were burned alive as examples, but she understood the basic mechanics from watching overseers. She lifted a flintlock rifle from its mount, surprised by how light it felt in her hands, how perfectly the stock fit against her shoulder. Power, she realized, was often just a matter of access. The masters weren't stronger or smarter or chosen by God. They simply controlled the tools of violence and wrote the rules that said only they could use them. She loaded the rifle with powder and shot from the mahogany cabinet, her hands steady despite never having performed this task before. Some knowledge lives in the blood, passed down from warrior ancestors who knew that survival sometimes required becoming the thing you feared most. Her Fulani mother had been a warrior before she was a slave. Her Mandinka father had led men into battle before he was property. Abeni was their daughter, and the genes of conquerors do not disappear simply because chains are applied. They sleep, they wait, they wake when the moment demands, and the moment was demanding everything now. The first overseer arrived at 4:30, summoned by one of the house slaves who had heard the strange silence emanating from the receiving room, a silence that felt wrong, pregnant with unspoken horror. His name was Mathieu Girard, a Breton peasant who had fled France to escape poverty and found wealth in the commerce of human suffering. He was not the cruelest overseer on La Couronne Noire. That distinction belonged to a Portuguese man named Costa who enjoyed creative torture, but Girard was thorough, methodical, a man who whipped with the dispassionate efficiency of someone performing necessary maintenance. He entered through the front door, calling Henri's name, his boots echoing in the foyer. He smelled it before he saw it, the copperpenny tang of blood, thick and unmistakable in the perfumed air. Monsieur Delacroix? Girard's hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his belt as he rounded the corner into the receiving room. What he saw froze him mid-step. Henri's body lay sprawled in a constellation of gore, his skull caved in like a rotten fruit, his eyes still open and staring at nothing. And standing in the archway leading to the interior of the house, backlit by the golden afternoon sun streaming through the western windows, was Abeni. She held the rifle with both hands, the barrel pointed directly at Girard's chest. For a moment, overseer and slave simply stared at each other across the chasm of a murdered master, both calculating odds, both understanding that the world had just shifted on its axis. Girard was not a stupid man. He had survived 5 years in Saint-Domingue by reading situations quickly and acting decisively. He saw in Abeni's eyes that she had already crossed the threshold from which there was no return, that she had nothing left to lose, that she was the most dangerous kind of human being, one who had chosen death over submission. His hand was still on his pistol, but drawing it meant gambling his life on being faster than a woman who had already killed today. "Don't," he said quietly in Creole, his voice stripped of all authority, reduced to the universal language of a man begging for his life. Abeni's finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder with a roar that shook the chandelier and sent birds exploding from the trees outside. The ball struck Mathieu Girard in the center of his chest, punching through ribs and sternum and vital organs before exiting in a spray of blood that painted the doorframe behind him. He staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air, his hands clutching uselessly at the wound as if he could hold his life inside his body through sheer will. He collapsed against the wall and slid down slowly, leaving a red smear on the white plaster, his eyes fixed on Abeni with an expression of profound disbelief, as if the natural order of the universe had just revealed itself to be a lie, as if gravity had reversed, and he was falling upward into a sky that rejected him. The sound of the gunshot carried across the plantation like a declaration of war. In the field, slaves stopped mid-motion, machetes suspended above sugarcane stalks, their heads turning toward the main house. In the overseer quarters, men grabbed weapons and began running. In the slave cabins, mothers pulled children inside and barred doors, knowing that whatever was happening would result in blood, probably theirs, possibly everyone's. The entire social architecture of La Couronne Noire, built on the illusion that some humans could own other humans, that violence flowed in only one direction, that the natural hierarchy was fixed and immutable, began to crack like ice over a frozen lake in spring. Abeni lowered the smoking rifle and looked at the second body she had created. Gerard's death had been different from Henri's, less personal, more practical, the elimination of an obstacle rather than an act of revenge. She felt the shift within herself, the transformation from victim to soldier, from slave to revolutionary, from woman to myth. She understood now what the Maroons in the mountains must have understood, what Macandal the poisoner had understood before the French burned him alive, what every rebel throughout history had understood, that freedom was not given but taken, not requested but seized, not negotiated but won through the currency the masters respected most, blood. She reloaded the rifle with hands that no longer trembled, muscle memory establishing itself after a single repetition, her body adapting to violence the way it had once adapted to 14-hour days in the cane fields. Through the tall windows she could see figures moving toward the house, 3 overseers, perhaps 4, their white shirts bright against the green ocean of sugar cane. They were shouting to each other in French, coordinating their approach with military precision. These were not soft-handed planters, but hardened men who had put down slave rebellions before, who had hunted runaways through jungle and mountain, who understood that their lives depended on maintaining the myth of white invincibility through relentless, disproportionate violence. Abeni moved to the window and smashed it with the rifle butt, sending glass cascading onto the veranda below in a glittering rain. She aimed at the closest overseer, a man named Lucien Beaumont, who had once whipped her unconscious for the crime of looking at him too long, and fired. The shot went wide, splintering the trunk of a palm tree 3 feet to his left. The overseers scattered, diving behind water troughs and equipment sheds, returning fire with their own rifles. Bullets punched through the walls of the main house, sending up puffs of plaster dust, shattering mirrors and vases, destroying in seconds the carefully curated gentility that had taken decades to construct. Abeni dropped below the window line as return fire chewed through the space where her head had been. She crawled to another window, rose quickly, fired again. This time her aim was true. Beaumont jerked backward as the ball caught him in the shoulder, spinning him like a top before he collapsed behind a rain barrel, screaming in agony. 2 down. How many more? How long could she hold this position? Hours? Minutes? It didn't matter. Every second she remained alive was a second the slaves in the fields watched a giant woman make war on her masters. Every shot she fired was a sermon louder than any missionary had ever preached. Every overseer who fell was proof that the system could bleed, could break, could die. The siege settled into a brutal rhythm. The overseers, now reinforced by armed plantation guards and several neighboring planters who had heard the gunfire and rode over with pistols and hunting rifles, surrounded the main house in a loose perimeter. They fired sporadically, probing for position, trying to pin down where Abeni was moving inside the labyrinth of rooms. She moved like a ghost through the house, appearing at different windows, firing, disappearing before they could return accurate fire. She used the rifle until its barrel grew too hot to touch, then switched to another from the collection. She had no formal training, no military education, but she possessed something more valuable: the desperate ingenuity of someone with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. In the fields, the slaves had stopped working entirely. They stood in clusters, watching the main house with expressions ranging from terror to something else, something dangerous and new. Kofi, an Ashanti man who had been plotting escape for 2 years, felt his heart hammering with possibility. Amma, a woman who had lost 3 children to the master's cruelty, found herself whispering prayers not for Abeni's surrender but for her victory. Thomas, a Creole man who served as translator between the French masters and African slaves, felt the careful neutrality he had cultivated for survival beginning to crack. They all understood what was happening. A line was being crossed that could never be uncrossed. A demonstration was being performed that would echo far beyond this single plantation, this single day. The planters understood this too, which was why they didn't simply burn the house down or wait her out. They needed Abeni taken alive, or at least her body intact enough to display. A rebellious slave who died in a fire was a martyr, a legend, a ghost story that could inspire others. But a rebellious slave captured and publicly tortured to death was a lesson, a warning, a restoration of the natural order. So they pressed in carefully, using cover, advancing by yards rather than rushing foolishly into the killing zone a woman with superior position and sufficient ammunition had created. By the time the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, 5 men lay dead or dying around the main house. The air was thick with gun smoke and the smell of torn earth where bullets had churned the manicured gardens into cratered wasteland. Inside, Abeni crouched behind an overturned mahogany table in what had been Henry's study, her breathing labored, her shoulder grazed by a musket ball that had carved a hot line through her flesh. Pain was relative. She had endured worse every day of her life: the whip, the sun, the soul-crushing weight of being property. This pain had purpose. This pain was chosen. She was running low on ammunition. 3 shots left, maybe 4 if she had miscounted. The planters knew it too. Their fire had intensified, forcing her to keep her head down, preventing her from moving freely through the house. They were preparing for a final assault. She could hear them coordinating outside, their voices carrying through the shattered windows. On my count. Cover the east entrance. Remember, we need her alive if possible. That last phrase made her smile, a grim expression that was more bearing of teeth than joy. Alive. They still thought they could break her, display her, use her destruction as propaganda for obedience. Abeni looked around the study, at the portraits of Delacroix ancestors staring down with painted superiority, at the ledgers that recorded her mother's purchase price, 800 livres. Her father's death, suicide by hanging marked as loss of capital, her own monetary value, 200 livres, adjusted for size and strength. She understood now that this room was the heart of the machine, the place where human beings were transformed into numbers, where souls were processed into profit. She grabbed one of the ledgers and hurled it through the window, pages fluttering like dying birds, then another, then another. Let them burn, she thought. Let every record of ownership scatter to the winds. Let history lose track of who belonged to whom. Let the accountants of hell scramble to reassemble their careful mathematics of misery. Pause here with me, in this suspended moment between defiance and destiny. What you are witnessing is not merely the story of one woman's rebellion. It is the sound of a world cracking open, the first tremor before the earthquake, the spark before the inferno that would eventually consume Saint-Domingue and birth Haiti, the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Abeni does not know this yet. She cannot see the future she is helping to create, cannot know that her name will be whispered in the slave quarters for decades to come, that mothers will tell their daughters, "Remember the giant woman who chose death over submission." If this story has gripped your soul, If you feel the weight of this moment, then join this journey. Subscribe to bear witness to the histories they tried to bury, the legends they could not kill. Comment below with one word: remember, because forgetting is what they want. Remembering is our revolution. Now, let us return to that house, to that woman, to the moment she became eternal. They came at twilight, when the boundary between day and night blurs into uncertainty, when shadows deepen and the world holds its breath before darkness claims dominion. 8 men moved in coordinated formation, 4 through the front entrance, 4 through the servant's door at the rear. They had torches now, flames casting wild dancing shadows that made the smoke-filled interior of the house feel like a vision of hell itself. Abeni heard them coming, their boots on marble, their whispered commands, the metallic click of hammers being cocked. She rose from behind the overturned table, rifle raised, and fired at the first silhouette that appeared in the doorway. The man, a planter named Rousseau from a neighboring estate, took the ball in his throat and went down gurgling, his torch falling and setting fire to the Persian rug beneath him. 2 shots left. The remaining men rushed forward, emboldened by numbers, by rage, by the masculine certainty that no woman, regardless of size, could stand against 7 armed men. They were wrong, but they would die learning the lesson. Abeni dropped the rifle and picked up the massive oak desk that had served as Henri's workspace, a piece of furniture that required 3 men to move during normal circumstances, and hurled it at the doorway. It crashed into 2 attackers with the force of a battering ram, crushing one man's ribcage and pinning the other beneath its weight, his legs shattered, his screams piercing the chaos like a knife. The remaining 5 hesitated, their courage wavering in the face of this impossibility, this woman who fought like a titan from Greek mythology, who seemed immune to fear or reason or the natural laws that governed ordinary humans. In that hesitation, Abeni charged, not away from them but toward them, closing the distance before they could bring their rifles to bear, becoming a storm of violence that moved with the inevitability of divine judgment. Her fist connected with the jaw of the nearest man, and the crack of bone was louder than any gunshot. He dropped instantly, unconscious before he hit the ground. The remaining 4 men scattered like startled birds, their military formation dissolving into primal panic. One, André Fontaine, a young overseer barely 20 years old who had taken this job to escape debt in France, fired wildly, his shot going wide and shattering a crystal decanter on the sideboard. Before he could reload, Abeni was upon him. She grabbed him by the collar and the belt and lifted him above her head as if he were a child, then threw him bodily through the already shattered window. He sailed through the air and landed on the veranda with a sickening crunch, his spine broken, his body folding at angles that defied anatomy. The 3 remaining men, Costa the Portuguese sadist, Jean-Baptiste the head overseer, and Etienne a plantation guard, formed a desperate triangle around her, bayonets fixed, circling like hunters around a wounded bear. "She's only one woman," Jean-Baptiste shouted, trying to rally courage that was rapidly deserting them all. "She bleeds like anyone else." But his voice carried the hollow ring of a man trying to convince himself of a lie. They had all seen what she was capable of. They had all watched her transform from property into predator, from victim into vengeance incarnate. Costa lunged first, his bayonet aimed at her midsection. Abeni sidestepped with surprising grace for someone her size and caught the rifle mid-thrust, tearing it from his hands and reversing it in one fluid motion. She drove the bayonet into his chest, pushing until the blade emerged from his back and pinned him to the wall like an insect in a collector's case. His eyes went wide with shock, with the ultimate betrayal of a body that refused to obey the mind's desperate commands to live. Jean-Baptiste and Etienne attacked simultaneously from opposite sides, a coordinated assault that might have worked against a normal opponent. But Abeni was no longer operating within normal parameters. She was beyond pain, beyond exhaustion, beyond the limitations of flesh. She was mythology being written in real time, divinity carved from rage and righteousness. She caught Jean-Baptiste's bayonet thrust with her left hand, simply caught the blade in her palm, letting it pierce through the meat of her hand until it scraped bone, then closed her fingers around it and held fast. Jean-Baptiste pulled frantically, trying to free his weapon, but he might as well have tried to pull a sword from solid stone. With her right hand, Abeni grabbed Etienne's rifle barrel as he fired, the muzzle flash scorching her palm, the ball meant for her heart, instead tearing through empty air beside her. She yanked both weapons toward her, pulling the men off balance, then headbutted Jean-Baptiste with such force that his nose exploded in a fountain of blood and cartilage. He stumbled backward, blind and concussed, and Abeni released his rifle only to seize him by the head with both hands, one on each side of his skull, and twisted. The snap echoed through the house like a tree branch breaking in a storm. His body went limp, a puppet with cut strings, and she let it fall. Etienne, the last man standing, dropped his rifle and ran. Not toward the door, survival instinct had abandoned logic, but deeper into the house, into the maze of rooms he didn't know, pursued by a force he couldn't comprehend. Abeni followed at a walk, unhurried, inexorable as a tide. She found him in the master bedroom, cowering behind Henri's four-poster bed, praying in rapid Portuguese to a god who had long ago abandoned this house, this island, this entire enterprise of human bondage. "Please," Etienne whispered in Creole, his hands raised in supplication. "Please, I have children. I have a wife in Porto. I was only following orders. I'm not like them. I never—" Abeni looked at him with eyes that had seen through every excuse, every justification, every attempt to separate the hand from the whip it wielded. "You were here," she said simply. That was the only truth that mattered. "You were here, you participated, you benefited." She reached down, lifted him by the throat, and carried him to the window. She held Etienne out over the window ledge, his legs kicking at nothing, his hands clawing at her iron grip, his screams carrying across the plantation to where slaves and remaining guards watched in frozen horror and fascination. For a long moment, Abeni simply held him there, suspended between earth and air, between life and death, giving him time to understand what it felt like to be utterly powerless, to exist at the mercy of another's whim, to know that your life held no more significance than the effort required to open a hand. Then she opened her hand. Etienne's scream cut off abruptly when he hit the ground 3 stories below, his body landing with the wet finality of meat hitting marble. Silence descended upon La Couronne Noire like a shroud. The remaining guards and planters who had surrounded the house had retreated to a safe distance, their appetite for assault completely extinguished. They had come to capture a rebellious slave and instead had encountered something from nightmare, a force of nature wrapped in human skin, a reckoning made flesh. Inside the main house, fires had started in multiple rooms where torches had fallen, flames beginning to consume the elegant trappings of colonial wealth, smoke billowing from shattered windows like the breath of a dying beast. Abeni stood at the window, silhouetted against the growing inferno behind her, her massive frame backlit by orange flame. Blood dripped from her wounded hand, from the graze on her shoulder, from a dozen cuts and abrasions that painted her skin in patterns of violence. She was dying. She knew this with absolute certainty. The blood loss, the exhaustion, the sheer impossible expenditure of energy required to hold off an army alone would claim her soon. But she had won something more valuable than survival. She had won terror. She had won respect. She had won the kind of victory that transcends the individual and becomes collective memory. That transforms a woman into a warning, a cautionary tale for masters who forgot that even giants could be pushed too far. They found her at dawn when the main house was nothing but a smoking skeleton of blackened timber and collapsed marble, when the flames had finally exhausted themselves on the wealth they consumed. Abeni sat in the center of what had been the receiving room, cross-legged among the ashes, her back against a crumbled column, her eyes open and staring at a horizon only she could see. She had bled out sometime during the night, her life pooling beneath her in a dark mirror that reflected nothing. In her lap, she held Henri's ledger, the one that recorded her purchase, her value, her categorization as property. She had burned every other record, but kept this one, perhaps as evidence, perhaps as testimony, perhaps simply as the last act of a woman claiming ownership of her own story. The slaves who were forced to remove her body reported that it took 6 men to lift her, that her hands were still clenched even in death, that her face bore no expression of pain or regret, only a terrible, transcendent peace. The planters wanted her remains desecrated, displayed, made into a lesson, but something stopped them. Fear, perhaps, or the superstitious dread that whatever had animated this woman might not be entirely gone, that mutilating her corpse might awaken something worse. They buried her in an unmarked grave beyond the plantation boundaries, in the red earth between the mountains and the sea. But you cannot bury a legend. Within a week, every slave on every plantation in Saint-Domingue knew the story of Abeni, the 7-foot woman who killed a master with her bare hands, who held off an army alone, who chose to burn rather than submit. Her name became a prayer, a promise, a prophecy. 14 years later, when the Haitian Revolution ignited and slaves rose up to throw off their chains and slaughter their masters by the thousands, they went into battle carrying her memory like a banner. And the masters, in their final moments, understood too late what they had created when they pushed a giant woman past the point of endurance. They had not broken a slave, they had forged a goddess of war, and goddesses once awakened do not sleep again.